Welcome back. In the last video, we established what banks are and why their monitoring role makes them pivotal for the transition. Now we turn to Part B, ESG and climate risks for banks. And the central claim here is one that took the industry surprisingly long to accept, but is now beyond dispute. That these risks are not a matter of ethics or public relations. They are financial risks, the kind that show up on the balance sheet and can bring a bank down. And if you're finding this valuable, do consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to keep up with what's next. Let me make that concrete. ESG factors don't only influence whether a borrower can repay, their creditworthiness. They also affect the value of the collateral behind the loan. Think of a mortgage if the house sits on a floodplain, or if new energy efficiency rules make an inefficient building expensive to bring up to standard, the collateral is worth less. And suddenly, collateral is worth less. And suddenly, so is the loan. Now here's why this transmission channel is so large for banks specifically. In many banks, around 60% of the entire loan book is real estate mortgages. So a risk that seems abstract, climate, energy regulation, lands directly on the single biggest asset class the bank holds. This is not a niche concern. It sits in the core of the balance sheet. To think clearly about climate risk, we split it into two families, and this distinction is one of the most important in the whole field. The first is physical risk, the direct damage of a changing climate. It comes in two flavors: acute events like floods, storms, and wildfires, and chronic shifts like sea level rise, sustained heat, and drought. Physical risk hits collateral and borrowers' assets directly. The second is transition risk, the risk that arises not from climate change itself, but from our response to it. Policy and legal change, technology shifts, and moves in market sentiment and reputation. Its signature outcome is stranded assets, assets that lose their value because the world decided to decarbonize. And notice the awkward relationship between the two. Both feed into the bank's credit, market, operational, liquidity, and reputational risk. And crucially, they trade off. Act late and you get more physical risk. Act fast and you get more transition risk. There's no path with neither. Let's trace exactly how these risks travel into the bank. Risk type by risk type, following the EBA, ECB, and NGFS. Credit risk, transition costs, physical damage, and stranded assets all raise the chance a borrower defaults, while collateral values fall, a double hit. Market risk, carbon-intensive bonds and equities get repriced. And volatility rises. Operational risk, damage to the bank's own buildings, yes, but also conduct, litigation, and greenwashing events. Liquidity risk, after a climate shock, depositors may pull money out, or borrowers may draw down their credit lines all at once. And reputational or business risk, stakeholder pressure, lost clients, and financing controversies. The lesson of this table is simple and profound. Climate risk is not a new, separate risk category you can wall off. It is a driver that flows through every risk the bank already manages. So banks build a discipline to handle this, and CARE calls it Environmental Credit Risk Management, ECRM. The idea is to integrate environmental and social risk directly into the existing credit risk process, rather than treating it as a bolt-on. Three channels are worth naming. Influence. The bank shapes outcomes through the very projects and borrowers it chooses to finance. Emerging risks, sustainability risks that over time turn into ordinary credit risks. Today's environmental controversy is tomorrow's default. And reputational risk, pressure from stakeholders that also feeds back into financial performance. ECRM is really just the recognition that a good credit officer in the modern world has to be part environmental analyst too. Now here is the framework I want you to carry through the entire chapter. There's a ladder of how deeply a bank integrates sustainability, and Schoenmaker and Schramad label its rungs Sustainable Finance 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. At SF 1.0, the logic is risk-based and the goal is simply to avoid. The bank keeps exclusion lists, no coal. The bank keeps exclusion lists, no coal, no controversial weapons, mainly to protect itself from reputational risk. Its value ranking is still shareholder value. At SF 2.0, still risk-based but more sophisticated, the bank prices ESG risk is built into the credit risk premium, so a riskier borrower pays more. The value ranking widens to stakeholder value. And at SF 3.0, the logic flips from risk to value. The bank sets out to create, to finance the transition, putting impact first. Its ranking becomes the common good and long-term value. Avoid, price, create. Remember those three verbs. Almost every bank you'll meet sits somewhere on this ladder. How does a bank operationalize this in practice? Some build a dedicated sustainability credit scoring system, and CARE describes the recipe. First, analyze the borrower's industry. Its outlook, its life cycle, the policy environment, its capacity for innovation. Second, define transition paths for that borrower, from business as usual to sustainable to future sustainable. Third, score across 6 dimensions: economic, environmental, social, socio-economic, eco-efficiency, and socio-environmental. And fourth, identify the material issues, derive specific questions from them, and assign weights to build the final score. It's the same architecture as an ordinary credit score, but pointed at sustainability. The elegance is that it produces a number a credit committee can actually use. Beyond scoring individual borrowers, many banks publish sustainability policies, usually with a general part and a sectoral part. The sectoral part is where it gets teeth. Westpac, for instance, committed to zero net deforestation. Rabobank set food and agri-standards for its clients. And the newest approaches go further still. They're transition-aligned, steering toward a 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius world. How? The bank takes technology scenarios for each industry, say the projected share of electric vehicles or renewable capacity over time, and grants loans consistent with that projected installed base. So the lending policy stops being a static blacklist and becomes a dynamic pathway. You're not asking, is this client clean today? But is this client on a credible route to where the sector needs to be? To decide what to focus on, banks increasingly publish a materiality matrix, a map of the issues that they and their stakeholders consider most important. Handelsbanken was an early adopter, and it's a nice example because it defined its material topics together with its stakeholders, rather than in a boardroom alone. It landed on 6: the bank and its customers, its role in the community, its indirect impact through lending and investment. Note that 1, it's the financed emissions idea again. The bank as an employer, its business culture, meaning ethics, anti-corruption, and anti-money laundering. And finally, the bank as an investment for its shareholders. The value of the exercise is that it forces the bank to say out loud what it thinks matters, and then be held to it. Here's a mainstream example to make it visual. ING's materiality matrix. The axes are what you'd expect: significance to stakeholders on one axis, impact on ING, and on society on the other. And each issue is plotted as a point. The topics that land in the top right corner, high on both axes, are the ones the bank commits to prioritizing and reporting on in depth. What I want you to take from this is not the specific dots, but the fact that a large conventional bank now does this at all. The materiality matrix has gone from activist demand to standard corporate disclosure. Now, all of this rests on judgments about the future, and the climate future is deeply, irreducibly uncertain. So banks and supervisors do something clever. Instead of a single point forecast, which would be false precision, they use scenario analysis. They ask, how would our portfolio fare under this coherent story of the future and under that one? To keep everyone comparable, the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, provides a common set of reference scenarios. Each scenario is translated into macro financial variables and then into changes in the two parameters every credit officer knows. The probability of default, PD, and the loss given default, LGD. These same scenarios underpin the ECB and Bank of England climate stress tests. So scenario analysis is the bridge between a vague climate story and a concrete number on the balance sheet. Let's look at the NGFS scenario families themselves, because their structure is beautifully logical. Arrange them by two risks: transition risk and physical risk. First family, orderly. We act early and smoothly, so both transition and physical risk stay low. Think net zero 2050 or below 2 degrees. Second, disorderly. We act, but late and abruptly, so transition risk is high, even though physical risk stays low to medium, the delayed transition, or a fragmented world. Third, hothouse world. We fail to act, so transition risk is low, but physical risk is severe, the current policies path. And fourth, the worst of both, too little, too late. Action comes late and uncoordinated, so we get high transition risk and high physical risk together. That fourth box is the one that should keep supervisors awake, and it's exactly the outcome our current trajectory risks producing. Let's recap. The headline of this video is that ESG and climate risks are financial risks. They flow through credit, market, operational, liquidity, and reputational risk, hitting both borrowers' ability to repay and the value of collateral, which for many banks is 60% mortgages. We split climate risk into physical and transition, and saw they trade off against each other. We climbed the integration ladder, sustainable finance 1.0 to 3.0, avoid, price, create. And we saw the machinery banks used to cope: sustainability credit scoring, sectoral policies, materiality matrices, and NGFS scenario analysis, feeding into probability of default and loss given default. In the next video, we push past climate to the next frontier, nature and biodiversity risk, and then dig into the hard empirical evidence on whether climate risk is really priced. See you there? We'll leave it there. Many thanks for watching. A subscribe helps the channel and makes sure you don't miss what comes next.